we see a lot of times with burnout, we become more cynical. We have a negative viewpoint of things. Our hopelessness kind of decrease, or our level of hope kind of decreases. Changes in our sleep, changes in our appetite, our thirst or need to reach for certain distractions, whether those are, with alcohol, with different substances, with all these things that we're constantly reaching to kind of be distracted in that moment to get some sort of relief, right? I mean, as we know, if those things get out of control, it's not a great path, right?
Welcome to the Payal Nanjiani Leadership Podcast. This is your host, Payal Nanjiani, and I am delighted to introduce our guest for today, Leah Marone. She is a psychotherapist, speaker, and corporate wellness consultant. Her areas of expertise are managing stress and anxiety, building resilience, and creating healthy boundaries. She facilitates empowerment groups for women and is a contributing blogger for Psychology Today. When working with corporations and teams on improving productivity, Leah focuses on issues around connection, leadership, and mental health. Outside of work, she enjoys traveling, gardening, hiking, and writing, and has also played Division I basketball and currently coaches her daughter's soccer team. Wow. And she is here today to talk with us about preventing employee burnout. Leah, thank you so much for your time in joining us here on the Payal Nanjiani podcast. I am so delighted to have you here with us, and that too on a topic which is so much needed these days. So welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Wow. So let's get started by just knowing you. And I read about you, and I would love to just have our audience know a little bit about your backstory here.
Sure. Okay. Well, let's see. I am a psychotherapist, so I do individual and family therapy. I guess I got into this field because I myself dealt with quite a bit of anxiety, performance anxiety related to sports growing up, and then all through college. So I really have a passion not only for athletes, but anxiety in general. And so my journey, I also think too, just with being an athlete in my past, kind of that level of resilience that you need and that stamina. But that is so, we can carry that over to any role in life. And so really speaking on that and pulling from that, and especially with what's been happening the last year and a half, it's been critical conversations. So I think, I love what I do. I love my field because there's so much diversity. There's so many different types of things that I can talk about and learn about and teach about. So, I consider myself an avid learner. I love to improve my listening and hear stories and just help where I can. So, yeah, I'm here.
That's quite an overview. That's great. So I think, the topic that you chose to speak today, and I was really awed by it, is because the time that we are in right now, especially because of this, COVID and the pandemic situation, almost everyone is working from home and they are working 24/7. I'm sure you must have seen that.
Yes, absolutely. And I think just as humans in general, we struggle a lot with transition. Like we're very prone to multitasking, especially now with all our devices and all the things and bells and whistles. But we struggle a lot of times with transitioning. And what I mean by that is sometimes going from one role to the next. We wear a lot of hats. And a lot of times going to the office or going to meetings or meeting people, we had a change in physical location. We had a change in preparing for that meeting or that role or that day. All of a sudden that went away and all of our roles kind of started to combine, right? And we found it, at least I know I did, and I think a lot of people I've worked with found it very hard to separate kind of going from doing a meeting and then helping a child maybe with a math problem or doing this and that, and kind of the chaos and restructuring ourselves and finding our footing again is a very tall order. And I think it's exhausting and we sometimes feel out of whack. And I think that was a lot of what the first chunk, and even some of it now, might be with the pandemic. So finding our footing again and really creating that structure, because all of us thrive with some sort of structure, whether it's a lot or whether it's a little. So that was a big tall order for us, and it still is.
So Leah, you are, into the wellness industry, and I'm sure you have seen a lot of people coming these days with burnout issues. So, what are the symptoms of burnout these days that you are observing, especially during this pandemic?
Right. So burnout essentially is mental or physical exhaustion, right? Kind of always feel like you're in that fight stage, right? There's constant stimulation. You're in the trenches. And so a lot of it though, we see different things like a lack of patience, right? We see an inability to focus the way that you did. I've had so many adults come to me throughout the pandemic in their 40s or 50s saying, I think I have ADD now. And I'm like, okay, well, it's not
themselves.
It's yes. And I'm like, well, it's not necessarily the diagnosis, but you are exhibiting symptoms. Yeah. And sometimes that can happen when we have reached max and when we are at capacity or when we are experiencing anxiety. Our inability to focus and task and orient ourselves is very difficult. We see a lot of times with burnout, we become more cynical. We have a negative viewpoint of things. Our hopelessness kind of decrease, or our level of hope kind of decreases. Changes in our sleep, changes in our appetite, our thirst or need to reach for certain distractions, whether those are, with alcohol, with different substances, with all these things that we're constantly reaching to kind of be distracted in that moment to get some sort of relief, right? I mean, and as we know, if those things get out of control, it's not a great path, right? We experience headaches, we experience body aches, low energy. So it's just kind of that, it's just exhaustion and kind of like, when is this going to end? And with burnout, if it's not addressed, if we're not paying attention to the signals that our body and our minds are trying to give us that something isn't working and where we need to make changes, that's what then leads us into those anxiety disorders and those depressive disorders.
Oh my God. And all of us, Leah, we have from beginning, we have been hearing health is wealth. And
absolutely,
it's going to, if you're saying these are the symptoms of burnout now, how is it impacting our health?
It is. And here's the thing, though. I think if we switch our operation and look at life and try to be more proactive than reactive, we're doing ourselves wonders. So if you think about, even in regards to the pandemic, we don't have much control. We didn't necessarily before, but we don't have much control. But there are certain things that we do. And that's like how we take care of ourselves and how we process things and how we respond to things. Now, that is easier said than done. That is a tall order. But I think, too, one framework that, if you don't mind if I speak to now, is just integrating the basics and what I like to call the 4 S's of structure. And that is really understanding, again, that we're human, we're living creatures, and we need the basics accounted for before we can move ourselves up the ladder and have these higher expectations of ourselves. So that means the 4 S's basically is sleep, making sleep a priority. And again, that's something that is highly compromised when we are experiencing a high degree of stress or anxiety or burnout. But establishing a routine, adults need them too, right? Disconnecting from our devices and monitoring the second S, which is sugar, right? Monitoring our sugar, monitoring our caffeine, acknowledging and being aware of what we're putting into our body to set ourselves up for that rest and rejuvenation. Having a routine and trying to get that consistent sleep is key. Sugar is the other S. And that's, again, to monitor again and be deliberate with what we're putting in our body. We don't have to be perfect, but we need to be aware of how that affects us. The third one is silence. And silence, all I mean by that is having time throughout your day that you can check in with yourself. You don't necessarily have to do anything about it if it's something kind of negative or hard to deal with, but just those check-ins and acknowledging where we are and disconnecting from things, being with ourselves for just a little bit and not constantly reaching for distractions is key. And then the last one is sweat. And sweat is more about just movement. Okay. It doesn't mean that you have to go out and run 5 miles every day and be sweating tremendously. If you are, great.
That's great.
It's great, but it means just moving your body. We're so stationary. So moving our bodies. And if that gives you a lot of variety, but it also keeps you structured with the things that really matter. And if those are consistently done, you're going to have some sense of control. You're setting yourself up for success. You're being proactive when stuff goes downhill.
But then what you said that now there is no boundaries now, between home and office. Everyone is working 24/7. We fail to understand where is the sleep gone, and to keep awake, there is a lot of intake of sugar and caffeine, and everyone is doing this because they have to keep up with their work. They have to keep up with their teams. They are global teams. So now everything has got together with everything. So in that way, Leah, what are the techniques that someone should use or apply in their lives so that while they are working, they can prevent or at least decrease the burnout that they are facing, and that would help productivity to come up.
Right. And there's so many different methods that we could talk about this all day. But the first one, I think, and a really big one that is a pandemic of its own, is again, multitasking. We are not productive a lot when we are working because we're doing 15 things at once. We're answering emails. We're seeing our Slack channel. We are getting another cup of coffee. We're trying to cram down our lunch. We're on the phone. Like, we are doing so much at one time and operating on such this sense of urgency. And it's contagious. You said it. Yeah. Everyone then feeds into that. And we are scrambling like there's a finish line and we got to get there really quick.
And right? You feel that, okay, if he or she is doing it, I'm left behind. So I also need to do it. So it becomes like a rat race, and now it's become all the more competitive, just being virtual.
Yes, and everything's so accessible, right? Yeah. So a lot of this deals with, and it's a tall order, but a lot of this deals with you reconnecting with what your limits are and setting your own personal boundaries. Now, that is not going to be like clockwork every day, but really finding time where you do unplug and learning how to be okay with that and taking that time to know that you are rejuvenating yourself. If you picture you have a balloon in your belly, all these things are constantly filling your balloon with air. And as we know, if we are not mindful of letting air out of our balloon from time to time and rejuvenating and taking care of ourselves and understanding how we're feeling or what's going on or what we think without being interrupted, our balloon pops. We burn out. We hit them where we're not productive. And so a lot of this is not only relying on us personally to come to grips with what's working for me and what's not. Where do I find good energy? Where can I exchange it productively? Where do I validate? Where am I feeling validated? And what do I need to simplify? Okay. The other side of that is this is a huge task for leaders. Leaders are so important right now. Corporate leaders, HR leaders, anyone leading a team, because everyone is looking to you to set the tone. Lean by example. If you're sending emails at 2 a.m., you are setting the precedent that that's normal. I know so many leaders who have really, and I commend them, have made such a point or such an effort in having their emails sent at 7 a.m. or later. Or if they find something that they're doing in the middle of the night and they got to write it down, they, make it so that it auto sends later in the morning. Because all of that is communicating certain norms and culture to their employees, right? So leaders have to do a better job, I think, at how they communicate when there are Zoom meetings. How are those meetings conducted? Are we checking in with each other, or are we just delegating and getting right to the point? The connection, we're connecting like this and we're accessible, but we're really not connecting on a human level that's taking care of what we need in order to keep people excited about their jobs and increase productivity.
But you just nailed it, Leah, when you said that if the leader is not setting the example, that's how it's going to go down in the culture. It's going to trickle down the effect. So in that way, how what is it that the leaders should do? Like, what is it that they should? How should they communicate with their employees, or in what way should they connect with them so that their employees are not facing that burnout? Like one of them, you said, with lead by example.
Yes. I mean, one of them is
they connect, and what other things can they do?
Right. I think a lot of it is it doesn't have to be these huge monumental changes. A lot of it is, again, if you and I were meeting and you were my boss or my leader, you taking the time to actually check in with me and say, how are you doing? How's your week going? What's working? What are some new things that you're doing? Building that rapport and that trust and really checking in with each other. You do not have to be a therapist and you do not have to solve anything. It is a support, not solve model. It is generating that support and actually making it the norm that employees can go to their leaders and say, I'm feeling like I can't get this done. I need help structuring my time. I need help setting boundaries. And the leader having and being comfortable and getting training if they need to facilitate some of those conversations. It's kind of like parenting. We want to raise children that are independent and can set their own boundaries in their own tone. But as parents, we also identify that if they're struggling, we got to step in and set a boundary for them. Right? And that's kind of the methodology that leaders need to have. If an employee is completely struggling and floundering, and you've had several conversations to try to help them generate like what's working, where can you step back, where can you work, and that's just not working, it might not be a good fit. And that's the other part of it. So there's a lot of different things that can go on. I will say too, and a lot of companies that I've been working with recently are having like, a lot of them are calling them wellness days. And they'll have maybe one day every 2 months or so where it's like everybody's off. Now I know some companies can't afford to do that, but recognizing like, okay, this is when we're going to have our intense meetings. This is when we're going to do this. But I also find that since everybody is so available, a lot of the people that I work with, they say, I have my meetings and I'm meeting after meeting after meeting, and I can't get my individual work done. So that's why I'm up all night doing it. And that's just, the framework is off, and that needs to be communicated up the ladder.
I've heard that so often. From not just from CEOs, but I'm hearing it even from leaders all across the spectrum that, I couldn't get the work done, so I've got to sit overnight and get it done. So Leah, just in your experience, what is one of the most common reasons that people come to you and say that we are burnt out? What's the most common reason for burnout? That you
the most common reason. Yeah, the most common, I mean, there's several, I'm trying to think of the most common. I think it is just when there's that feeling of there's just lack of control. There's that feeling where you're constantly putting out and you're burning energy, but there's not enough sources for you to regain it and rejuvenate. And you're not feeling supported. That's a big one. I think when people aren't feeling supported, when they're not feeling validated, when they're not feeling heard. And again, as leaders, that doesn't mean you need to put out fires concretely and know every answer to everything. That's not what it means. So a lot of times I'll work with leaders and companies on changing up our verbiage, changing up our support. And again, following that support and not solve methodology to help people take ownership of what's going on, but being a support. But I think the burnout too, especially with what's going on, is just the constant change, the constant not knowing what's happening, the constant feeling like, okay, I feel like I have things together, and then something changes. And such is life, but we're feeling it on such levels that we have not experienced it before.
Wow. I think there's so much of uncertainty. So tell me, Leah, I know your time is also very precious, but I definitely want to know what would be your advice to people, in the corporate world, in the business world. What would be your advice to help them, decrease their burnout and to be more productive?
Right. Ooh, okay. Well, I think the biggest thing is, I've been talking about structure, and that's a tall order. But I think a lot of it is really, again, going back to the basics of just us being human and understanding that if you are constantly operating like you're constantly running the race, you're doing it wrong. Resilience is actually very different than stamina. Stamina, we have an end game. We have a finish line. We have a date. We have an end of a project. And a lot of us have been operating with that. And then we get to rest. We don't have that right now. We don't have a definitive date of when things end and what things are going to look like. So resilience, again, is generating that self-awareness, pushing when you need to, but also time for rest and recovery. And so if we don't start taking care of ourselves and the basics and learning to tap in and become more self-aware and learn how to communicate, it's just not going to work. And we're seeing that happen. So I think it's boundary setting, it's creating a structure, it's communicating, it's leaders stepping up and doing the same for their employees. Okay. But I mean, there's so many different things that you can do. I will share one little quick tip. It's called, I've shared this with a lot of people over the last months, but it's a simple technique, but it's called bookends. And so I like to call it that because you are very deliberate with having an AM bookend or something that is yours in the morning. It doesn't have to be this monumental thing. It could be a workout. It could be sitting alone in a space by yourself without your phone and drinking your cup of coffee and utilizing all your senses and just being there. Presence. It could be a lot of different things. And you have something that's sacred to you in the morning that you're not multitasking with. The middle of the day, as we know, can be chaos and a lot of things out of our control. Yeah. But in the evening, again, there's some type of practice, something that is yours. Wow. Where you're isolated with it, that you end your day with. This not only sets us up for better night's sleep, but it gives us a boundary. It gives us a sense of control that's rejuvenating and our own in the midst of chaos.
Wow, I think that's a beautiful analogy to wrap this up. This was awesome, Leah. So thank you so much for being here with us on this episode of the Payal Nanjiani Leadership Podcast. It was really great to have you, and the insights that you have shared regarding employee burnout and how to avoid it and how to be more productive. I think those were really simply great. So thank you so much, Leah.
Oh, thank you too. It was my pleasure.
Thank you. And here's for all our listeners. You can stay connected with me on LinkedIn and Instagram, as well as follow Leah on her social media page. This is Leah and Payal signing off for this episode. Until the next time, wishing you loads of success.